Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. We would look today into the application of international economic sanctions with respect to the trade in Russian metals. And we will try to give an overview of how these sanctions affect a substantial variety of Russian metals, including precious metals like gold or silver, or non-precious metals like nickel, aluminum, copper, or other non-precious metals. And more specifically, we would discuss the following points. First, we would look into the complexities of sanctioned metals. One of those complexities is already clear. There are many metals, both precious and non-precious, and each of them has very specific function in world economy. And there are nuances and there are specificities as to the extraction, production, and subsequent integration of metals into the production chains. We will then talk about two types of sanctions which have been used to restrict trade in Russian metals: embargo-based sanctions and quota-based sanctions. And then we would consider how the current sanctions regime aim to restrict the trade between Russia and third countries, or in products produced in third countries and which incorporate Russian metals. So let us first of all set the general stage for the problem before we consider specific legal norms which are relevant for sanctioning Russian trade in metals. The first point to acknowledge is the critical role of many metals for national economies, both from the pure economic perspective. In some countries, mining and production of metals still play a major role. For example, in Belgium, there are substantial metal production facilities, or in Italy. So for these jurisdictions, production of metal, of steel, is an important part of the economy where a substantial number of persons remain employed. But apart from that, metals play an important role into broader development objectives. For example, environmental transition. Nickel, for example, is an important component for the production of electric vehicles. Lithium is essential for batteries, and copper is the metal of electricity. Almost any electronic device would have some elements of copper. The second point to consider is the effect which the sanctions cause and the effect which we want the sanctions to cause. The stated purpose for sanctioning the trade in Russian metals is to reduce Russian revenues resulting from such trade. It's important to consider, though, that by sanctioning a specific product, for example, by way of imposing embargo, and as a result of that embargo, prohibiting the sale of the product in a specific market, we drive up the prices. And by driving up the prices, we can very well have the situation that even by selling a smaller amount of products, the relevant country will generate a higher income. This was the case, for example, in 2018, when the United States sanctioned the UBO of Rusal. And as a result of those sanctions, global prices for aluminium increased by 30% within a very short period of time. And such substantial increase resulted in the final removal of those sanctions. So it's important to note that quantitative restrictions ultimately may not necessarily result in the decrease of revenues generated by sale of a smaller amount of metals, but at a higher price. The second point to consider is that in the modern globalized world, the markets in metals are also global. So it's not that difficult for a country to reorient its exports towards sanction neutral jurisdictions. And these sanction neutral jurisdictions may very well then just export their products to the sanctioned jurisdictions, which in practical terms may result in slightly higher costs for the transportation of metals, but in principle will serve no objective of decreasing the revenues. The final point to note is that metals are fungible products and are mainly used for the production of other products. So when you sanction metals coming from a specific jurisdiction, a question always arises as to how would you treat the products produced in third-party jurisdictions, incorporating those metals. In simple words, how you would treat a Chinese electric vehicle using Russian lithium for the production of batteries or Russian nickel for the production of the vehicle itself. How would you treat a cell phone incorporating Russian copper? So these are the very complex questions which jurisdictions have to consider, and certainly the answer would depend on a specific situation. Some jurisdictions are less dependent on Russian metals historically. For example, the United States can easily export those metals from just across the border, Canada or Brazil. Other jurisdictions may be more dependent. There are historical integrations between economies. So all this raises complex questions and compromises, and we would now see how those are reflected in the specific legal provisions which regulate trade in Russian metals. We would start by UK program for the reason that UK so far have introduced one of the most comprehensive restrictions with respect to Russian metals. They are found in several regulations, so there's not a single legal provision which deals with the matter, which makes the application of restrictions sometimes complex. And in principle, those restrictions apply to the following categories of metals. So first of all, iron and steel products, then gold and gold jewelry. Then there is a category of other metals, which in the UK include a vast number of metals, including copper, nickel, aluminum, zinc, lead, tungsten, magnesium, cobalt, and a few other metals. So there is a substantial list of the metals. And finally, there are the goods, so-called high revenue generating goods for the Russian exports. And those categories of goods, although not specifically dealing with metals and primarily not included metals, have historically included also certain Russian metals. So for example, silver would be there. So the main feature of the UK program is the complete ban for the import of a wide variety of Russian metals. This refers to other metals, which I mentioned and which are substantial in number. Steel and steel products, although there is no complete ban for iron and all categories of steel products, the nomenclature subject to restrictions are quite substantial. Important that the restrictions as a general rule apply to the imports. So there is a ban on imports of the relevant metals into the UK and or any ancillary services with respect to those imports, like financing, insurance, transportation, shipping, this type of services. Certainly, if import is prohibited, any related service to import shall equally be prohibited. But for certain categories of metals, the restrictions apply also with respect to trade between Russia and third countries. So, for example, a UK trader would be prohibited to trade, for example, other metals with third-party jurisdictions. Nevertheless, this specific prohibition, which is certainly more controversial, is not universal, and you need to check metal by metal whether this prohibition applies. With respect to third country products incorporating Russian metals, the rule in general is that to the extent the relevant metal is subject to substantial processing in a third-party jurisdiction, the relevant product which incorporated Russian metal is not treated as subject to restrictions. Nevertheless, there are some notable exceptions to this rule with respect to trade in Russian gold and in Russian iron and steel products, where third-party products, even if they underwent substantial processing in a third-party jurisdiction, to the extent they include any of those metals, are subject to import restrictions. The way this rule operates is that both the source product, so the product which was imported from Russia into a third-party jurisdiction, let's say, for example, steel slabs, and the resultant product, let's say, rolls of steel, have to be subject to restrictions. And if both those products are subject to restrictions on import, then the third-party product may not be imported. On the other hand, when Russian base product was used for the production of a product which is not subject to restrictions, so for example, electric vehicles, then the restrictions do not apply and the relevant electric vehicles can be imported in a third-party jurisdiction. Obviously, it's a very complex process to verify if and to what extent the relevant product includes Russian base, first of all, iron or steel products. And here the responsibility is on the relevant operators to demonstrate through the documents the production chain has not used the relevant Russian products in the process of processing the product in a third-party jurisdiction. In the United States, the relevant legal basis for prohibiting or restricting trade in Russian metals is Executive Order 14068, as amended by Order 1414. And in essence, the order permits to designate certain categories of products, including metals, which cannot be imported into the United States. So it's important to note that the US restrictions primarily operate with respect to the imports into the United States. And second, they primarily operate with respect to the products of Russian Federation origin. So the focus is on Russian metals and imports in the United States, rather than, for example, trading with third-party jurisdictions or products being processed in such third-party jurisdictions and then imported into the United States. And nevertheless, Executive Order 1414 amended the original executive order with a view to allow the designation also the products which underwent substantial processing and include base Russian metals, as well as the prohibition to the with respect to the products which have been transported or transited the Russian Federation. So far, the United States made two designations with respect to trade in Russian metals. The first one related to aluminum, copper, and nickel. The second one to gold, and there is the third one, technical designation with respect to warrant and services and trade of those metals on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So with respect to these four metals, copper, nickel, aluminum, and gold, the restriction applies only with respect to imports into the US and only with respect to Russian origin metals. So it doesn't affect trade with third-party jurisdictions, and as such doesn't affect third country products incorporating Russian metals. Important to note, and this refers to any sanctioning program, that trade in metals may be restricted not only by those sanctions which are specifically designated for this purpose, so which specifically restrict the import or other type of operations with respect to Russian metals, but the restrictions can also come indirectly from the designation of major Russian steel producers or mining companies or UBOs of those mining companies and steel producers with more than 50% ownership or control as far as these European sanctions are concerned. And these restrictions can also indirectly restrict the trade in certain Russian metals which are produced by those companies. We would now look into the third type of sanctions affecting Russian trade in metals, the EU sanction program, which I call a quota-based program. The EU sanctioning program is complex because it operates with a wide number of nomenclature. So you literally need to go position by position to check whether the relevant metal or products of metal are prohibited. Nevertheless, except for a limited number of metals, there is no outright prohibition for trade. So there would be typically quotas provided for the most critical goods. The only relevant prohibition for trade in metals so far relate only to lead, silver, and gold. For the other metals or products of metals, there are typically some quota-based exemptions for the most critical goods. In the EU, the relevant restrictions again are dispersed across multiple provisions in the Regulation 833. The first one is Article 1A, which deals with restricting trade in Russian revenue-generating exports. So again, like in the UK, there would be mostly metals unrelated items. However, there is a substantial number of metals or metal-based products there. So it's an important article to consider when considering the trade in Russian metals. So for example, aluminium and all aluminium products are there. Surprisingly, although there is a special Article 3G dealing with trade in Russian iron and steel products, also some steel products and iron products are here. So for example, pig iron is subject to restrictions in Article 3I and not Article 3G, as one might consider to be more logical and consistent. Silver is here, lead is here. So Article 3I, not directly addressing the question of metals, still includes a substantial number of metals which are subject to restrictions. Article 3G deals specifically with steel and steel products. In essence, the approach is quite similar to the UK sanctioning program, that there is a long list of nomenclature which is prohibited or subject to quota restrictions for the imports. And there is a complete ban on imports of gold and jewelry, including Russian gold, into the European Union. Unlike US and to a more comprehensive measure than the UK, EU operators cannot deal in restricted metals worldwide. So for example, Russian silver or lead, or for example, aluminium cannot be traded worldwide by an EU operator, and no ancillary services, meaning brokering services, technical financial assistance, may be provided in connection with that worldwide trade of these metals. Similar, there are rules with respect to third-party products which incorporate Russian origin metals, and those apply to gold, iron, and steel products. The rule is the following: to the extent the source metal and the resultant product fall within the restriction, the import of this third-party product will be restricted in the European Union. To the extent typically the resultant product is not subject to the restriction, the product can be imported. So I would now try to summarize the overall considerations which an operator dealing with Russian metals or generally in metals needs to be aware of in the current sanction environment. The first point to note is whether you deal with the imports of Russian origin metals into the relevant sanction jurisdiction. And the points here to note are as follows. First of all, although there are general principles, and on some metals, for example, gold, also consistent in details, with respect to other metals, there is different treatment across different jurisdictions, and a careful analysis needs to be made of what are the parties involved in the relevant trade, what is the origin, and what laws apply. The UK implied the most comprehensive ban against a substantial number of Russian metals, more than 20. In the US, this ban relates just to 4 metals. In the EU, the restrictions apply to a wider variety of products, but the categories of restrictions, whether quota-based or embargo-based restrictions, will depend on a case-by-case basis. So the bottom line here to note is that there is a general idea of restricting trade in Russian metals, but each jurisdiction is dealing with it in its own way and form. Second point to remember is that these restrictions are not summarized in a single legal provision or legal act, and sometimes they are found with respect to the same categories of products in various provisions, as we saw in connection with iron and steel products in the European Union, when both articles 3I and 3G may be relevant depending on the type of product you're dealing with. Last point to remember in terms of general analysis is that the trade is not restricted by those provisions which specifically relate to restricting trade, but can be also indirectly restricted by asset-free sanctions with respect to Russian mining companies or their UBOs, complete embargoes to trade in goods coming from areas of Ukraine currently occupied by Russia, where also substantial metal producing facilities are located. So it's important to note that the analysis does not end with the specific rules relating to trade in metals. Second point to remember is that the restrictions are not limited to the imports of metals or metals products into the sanctioned jurisdictions, but can also affect the dealings in the Russian metals between Russia and third-party jurisdictions. So, for example, the sale of Russian metals to China or to India or to Turkey. Here, the rules are different across jurisdictions. In the EU, this would be completely prohibited. In the US, generally not restricted. And in the UK, will depend on the type of metal you're dealing with. Final point to note is that the substantially processed goods from third-party jurisdiction, meaning not from Russia, may also be subject to restrictions on imports to the extent they incorporate Russian metals. This relates for the time being to those goods which may incorporate Russian iron and steel products or gold. And the rule here, as we've discussed, is that first the relevant metal, which is the base, shall be subject to restriction, and the resultant product shall also fall within the nomenclature of products subject to restrictions. I trust that you found this presentation useful as a starting point for your analysis, and I hope to see you during my subsequent presentation. Thank you very much for watching.